One evening in March of 1974, an investigator in Salt Lake City, Utah, sat across an interrogation table from a man who claimed he had psychic powers. Now, the investigator had naturally been quite skeptical of this man and his powers, but the man began giving him a bunch of very specific visions about the case the investigator was trying to solve. And in fact, some of the information he was revealing was enough to make the investigator wonder, could this man actually be a psychic? Or was he the killer? On March 11th, 1974, 22-year-old Barbara Rockey sat at a desk in her bedroom in Provo, Utah, writing furiously. And as she was writing, eventually she paused for a minute to reread what she had written, but she wasn't quite happy yet, so she added a few more lines. The letter she was writing was for her roommates, and she knew it had to be perfect, because Barbara was saying goodbye. So Barbara was a junior at Brigham Young University, or BYU, which was a very religious school where most students were practicing Mormons, but not Barbara. She had chosen to go to BYU because of religion, but really just because she was fascinated by it and thought going to a school structured around faith would be very interesting. But when she actually got there, she immediately felt out of place. Barbara was from California and considered herself more of a free spirit who liked exploring new ideas and trying new things. She'd just moved in with 7 other girls in January, but now, just 2 months into that, it was already very obvious that those girls did not like her. They were just as religious as the rest of the kids at BYU, and they seemed to think Barbara was weird for doing things like dating around and experimenting with different religions. So Barbara had decided that instead of trying to change her roommates' minds, she would just lean into this kind of weird behavior, as they called it. Barbara basically started making them uncomfortable on purpose, like by saying she prayed to the devil, which totally shocked them. They were now actively scared of her, which really alienated Barbara a whole lot more. And so all of that was why Barbara was now writing this letter. She was telling her roommates that she was just going to go ahead and leave campus for a while to be with people that actually understood her. And the people she was thinking of were people like Richard Finder, a self-proclaimed psychic that Barbara had connected with after she'd called into a radio show where Richard had been giving psychic readings. And the two of them had connected immediately. They'd had this really intense relationship that felt both romantic and spiritual at the same time. But there was another reason Barbara wanted to get away from BYU. And that was because she had started to feel unsafe being a young woman on a college campus. So recently there had been some scary national news stories about college women being attacked on campus. One student in Washington State had been beaten and almost killed in her dorm room in January. And another woman had gone missing the following month. And so as a precaution, Barbara had been taking judo classes at school and even got her best friend, Jerry Hicker, to help her buy a gun. Except Barbara had actually lost her gun recently. So she grabbed the letter and put it inside of her purse, where she also was holding a turquoise necklace, which she planned to sell that day. She'd figure out her actual destination based on how much she got for it. About 3 hours later, Barbara's best friend Jerry walked up the sidewalk to Barbara's house. He thought they had plans to meet up that afternoon, but Barbara never showed. But after beginning the walk back to his place, he passed by an apartment complex down the street from Barbara's place, and he stopped because he could clearly see Barbara's car parked in the lot, which was definitely out of the ordinary because Jerry was sure she did not know anybody who lived there. He saw there was a note, and so he just opened up her car because he found it was unlocked, and he grabbed the note and he began to read it. And as he did, he felt his heart rate start to pick up. An hour later, Jerry ran into the campus police station with Barbara's roommates following right behind him. The note was a goodbye letter that Barbara apparently had written, and it said that she was leaving to be with her people. And the tone of it was just kind of alarming, and the officer on duty said, okay, we'll look into it. The next day, almost 50 miles north of the BYU campus, a worker for a Utah utility company hiked up a trail in Big Cottonwood Canyon, a hilly nature preserve on the outskirts of Salt Lake City. Officially, he was there to check on some water lines, but he was also, taking his time and enjoying himself. So this guy was genuinely shocked when he reached the top of the trail and saw he was not alone. There was a woman up there. But at first, the way his brain processed what he was seeing is he saw this woman who was lying on the ground and she appeared to be nude or partially nude, and he thought, oh, she's sunbathing, like that's what she's doing up here. But then he's like, it's March, it's cold, and she's face down, and she's definitely totally naked. And then he took a few more steps forward, and his brain kind of processed what he was seeing, at which point he just gasped, turned around and ran back to his car to go alert the police. Within the hour, Captain Pete Hayward with the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office drove his cruiser along a remote access road that led to Big Cottonwood Canyon. There was a body of a naked woman lying face down on the ground. And right away, he could see at least 3 bullet wounds in the woman's back. Hayward looked next to the body, and he saw the woman's clothes and shoes were right nearby, and each item was actually folded very neatly, which struck him as a little bit strange. Hayward felt pretty confident that this woman was likely shot and killed in the exact spot she was found in. The next day, Wednesday, March 13th, Hayward hustled down a hallway towards a meeting room at the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office. He'd just come from a meeting with the ballistics expert who told him the gun that killed this woman was likely a .357 caliber. It was 22-year-old Barbara Rockey. Hayward was on his way to get a formal statement from a young man named Jerry Hicker. Jerry was one of the people who identified the body, and he was the first person to report Barbara missing. Minutes later, Hayward sat down at a conference table across from Jerry. And from the looks of it, Jerry was very rattled. So he just bluntly told Jerry that he needed to know every single thing that happened on the day Barbara went missing. He took a shaky breath and then explained how he'd borrowed Barbara's car the day before and then dropped it back off at her place on Monday morning around 10 a.m. And then he went to the library for a few hours. He then said he was supposed to meet up with Barbara. They had plans for later that day to hang out, but Barbara didn't show up. And when he went to her house to check on her car was gone. And so he began walking back home again when he actually saw her car down the block outside of an apartment complex that he didn't understand she would be at. Looked inside and saw there was a note. He tried the door handle, it was open, he reached inside, got the note out, and he read it, and he said it was a pretty disturbing note. He thought it was maybe a suicide note. According to one of the roommates, right before Barbara had disappeared, she had mentioned that she planned to pawn a turquoise necklace that she owned in Salt Lake City. He stepped into this particular pawn shop, and he asked the woman behind the counter if they had recently purchased a turquoise necklace. And to his shock, the woman said yes. And then she gestured towards a glass case behind the counter where Hayward could see a long white necklace lined with turquoise stones on a red felt pad. Barbara was at the store on March 11th at 12:50 p.m., the same day she went missing. But the most incredible part of this new lead was that Barbara had apparently told this clerk that she was in a hurry because her boyfriend was circling the block outside. As soon as Hayward parked and hurried inside the precinct, he was stopped by a deputy. The deputy told Hayward that he wasn't going to believe this, but they had been continuing their background interviews, and some of Barbara's friends said that Barbara had mentioned a boyfriend named Richard Finder, a supposed psychic from California who just happened to be in town on a ski vacation at the same time Barbara was killed. And the reason they knew that was because Richard had just called the station completely out of the blue and offered to help. A few hours later, Hayward sat down across an interrogation table from 30-year-old Richard Finder. Hayward had spent the last couple of hours digging into Richard, and he also discovered that he owned a .357 pistol, the same kind of gun that had killed Barbara. And on top of that, he found out the place where Richard was staying was in Salt Lake City, very close to Big Cottonwood Canyon, where Barbara's body was found. Hayward cut to the chase and just asked Richard point blank why he had called the station. And at that point, Richard became very serious and said that he needed to come forward because he had a feeling about what had happened to Barbara. He said, he was a psychic, and he had a vision that the gun, the murder weapon, had been thrown in some water somewhere. Hayward couldn't believe what he was hearing because, the police had not announced the murder weapon was missing. Richard shouldn't have known they were looking for the murder weapon, but clearly he did. He demanded that Richard account for every single hour of his day on Monday, March 11th, the day that Barbara went missing. And for the first time, Richard actually seemed genuinely thrown off. He just sort of stared back at Hayward in what seemed to be complete shock. And then he said he didn't kill Barbara. He said he couldn't have. He was with his friends the whole day. In the fall of 2005, so over 25 years after Barbara's murder, Detective Todd Park sat on the floor by his desk in the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Department. Around him on the floor, it was covered with crime scene photos and interviews and evidence logs from the 1974 investigation of Barbara Rocky's murder. Park was a brand new homicide detective, and he had taken on this case after getting a call from one of Barbara's sisters, begging the sheriff's office to reopen it, even though during the original investigation, they hadn't relied on DNA testing. They couldn't really even do DNA testing. Despite that, the investigators at the time had done a rape kit and saved all the evidence from the scene, like Barbara's clothes and even the dirt that was underneath her body, which meant that with the current advancements in DNA technology, there was a good chance they could actually solve this thing. 2 years later, on an afternoon in October of 2007, Park paced around his office and periodically stopped to look at the phone on his desk. He was waiting for a call from the lab. So at this point in Park's re-investigation of Barbara's murder, the DNA testing had basically gotten them nowhere. Over the last 2 years, the medical lab had gone over almost every single item from Barbara's case, like her rape kit swabs and her clothes. But they hadn't been able to get any DNA from anything. It either wasn't there or was just too old and not preserved well enough. And so the only thing left to test was the dirt that the original investigators collected from underneath Barbara's body. Park's phone finally rang. They told him they had a profile. Based on DNA evidence and a decades-long investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Barbara Rocky on March 11th, 1974. Just before noon, the killer watched Barbara pull up to the sidewalk in her car. The killer immediately walked over and jumped inside and smiled at Barbara, and she smiled right back. And together, they drove to the pawn shop in Salt Lake City that Barbara wanted to go to. When they got there, Barbara hopped out of the car and went inside. And once she was inside, the killer moved over to the driver's seat. They had decided that today, they were finally going to make their relationship physical. So when Barbara came outside and hopped in the passenger seat of the car after selling her necklace, the killer very excitedly turned to her and said, "Hey, there's some trails nearby. Why don't we go for a hike?" And so the killer very excitedly drove the car over to the canyon and parked near a picnic area. Then the two of them got out, and as they began walking towards the trail, the killer reached down and touched the outside of their pocket, just to make sure the gun that they had stolen from Barbara was still there. Now, they didn't know if they were going to use the gun or not, but they just wanted to make sure it was there and ready. And so for a while, the killer and Barbara just hiked along this trail, just chatting and making their way up and enjoying the scenery. But at some point, the killer they couldn't wait any longer. They had to make their move. And so they stopped Barbara. And the killer, after making sure nobody else was around, they moved forward and kind of made their move. They touched Barbara in a way that was very clearly meant to be romantic. But immediately Barbara kind of recoiled and jumped back and told the killer that she didn't want that, which immediately made the killer incredibly angry. And so the killer stepped towards her again and could see Barbara had this alarmed look on her face, which made them even more angry. So they pulled out Barbara's gun and they aimed it at her and then told her to take off her clothes. And Barbara, she was horrified, but she did as she was told, but she intentionally was taking her time. As she took off a piece of clothing, she would painstakingly fold it very neatly, all the while begging the killer not to do this. And then after taking off all of her clothes and stacking them next to her, she continued to plead with the killer. But the killer was so humiliated and so angry that they decided enough was enough. And they shot Barbara right in the chest. And she crumpled to the ground, and they fired wildly several more times until Barbara went still. And then once Barbara was either dead or dying on the ground, the killer just panicked and turned and ran back down the trail, back to Barbara's car. They hopped in and they drove back to Provo and the BYU campus. The reason they parked Barbara's car down the road near that other apartment complex was so that when the killer got out of the car, Barbara's 7 roommates would not see them doing so. Then they fled, leaving Barbara's note in the car. Barbara's note was not a suicide note. It was a literal goodbye note that she had written for her roommates. It would turn out Barbara's killer was her best friend, Jerry Hicker. The original investigators didn't suspect Jerry at first, mainly because of his cooperation, and since he was the one who also first reported her missing. But they did begin to get suspicious of him when he eventually revealed his violent streak. The year after he killed Barbara, he was connected to a few different rape cases on campus. But they didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest until decades later, and so ultimately, Jerry killed Barbara with her own gun, which he had helped her buy so she could protect herself from killers just like him. By the time Jerry was arrested in 2007, he was dying of cancer. He confessed to Barbara's murder for a reduced sentence and served 5 years before he was released. He died in 2014.